The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability. The coronavirus outbreak This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.
Welcome and thank you for joining us at the Atlantic Dialogues. The webinar is being broadcast live via our YouTube channel and Facebook page, so please feel free to share your thoughts and ask questions using the chat. I'm Eduardo Haddad, Professor of Economics at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, from where I speak, and Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and I'll be your moderator today. Our session is about the role of ICT in the management of global crises. And in modern societies, technology plays an important role and thus creates new challenges. Information, of which ICT is the vector, has become a strategic resource. Today, ICTs are already playing a central role in the fight against global inequalities. They are now asserting themselves in both developed and emerging countries as tools to help formalize development and crisis management strategies. The change brought about by the use of ICTs are visible everywhere. Indeed, crisis management cannot function effectively without the support of advanced ICTs. Therefore, it becomes essential to take advantage of various technological innovations, such as artificial intelligence, for the design of optimal and suitable models for crisis management. In this context, what's true for developed and emerging countries is equally true for poor countries, and especially for Africa. This session will try to better understand whether and how the use of ICTs would have an impact on crisis management. It will also address the prospects for adapting ICTs to the crisis management process. To discuss this fascinating topic, we have today 4 distinguished panelists. We are waiting for one of them to join us, with various experiences in dealing with ICTs that will enrich our understanding on how information can help on the management of crisis. I'm glad to introduce them. Mohamedou Khan, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, the American University of Nigeria. We are waiting for him to join us. But we already have here with us Janet Nelson, Latin American lead for the Amazon Web Services Institute, a think tank focusing on technological solutions for public policy problems. We also have with us Prince Boadu, CEO and co-founder of MapTech Logistics Limited, and also Jessica Berling, founder and managing director of Construct. The three of them emerging leaders at the Policy Center in different years. Well, let me start with Jana Nelson. And Jana, reading your CV, I was amazed by your large experience in doing things, in making things happen. Thus, I would like you to share your thoughts on the following questions. Do you think crisis management would be realistic thanks to the evolution of ICTs? How do you see the role of ICTs are playing during the pandemic crisis? So please, Jana.
Thank you. Good morning from this side of the Atlantic. Good afternoon to those over on your side, or in Jessica's and Prince's side. Yes, I mean we've seen throughout this whole year that technology is crucial for the solution or for solving or helping solve crises, especially in this instance in which we're all home, but also in natural disasters. There are all a number of examples, starting from backups to being able to set up telecommunication systems or just getting people back into their normal daily lives after a crisis. But in this pandemic specifically, technology was crucial in the first few months, and I would argue still is now that we're in this, at 11 months now and counting. It was crucial and helpful for 4 different reasons. The first one is it helped citizens during the pandemic, during the time in which we didn't have that much information, right? So all these apps that sprung up in different countries. We had an app in Argentina that did multiple things. It triaged, right? So if you had symptoms, you could go into the app and put the symptoms, and the app would tell you, should you find a doctor, should you not? It would do contact tracing, and it would give you information about the spread of the disease. How many people have the disease in your city, so that you know, should you be worried? Should you go to the supermarket? Should you go out? Should you not? There was also apps that were used to allow people to go out during lockdown, right? So if you had a need, you request from the government this special permission to go out. And that was the case in Chile, for example. But it also helped people that were unemployed. Through technology, massive demands of bonds and emergency aids were attended, where the governments could resolve these peaks in demand that they had never had before through technology by using it both for the financial services sector, but also for the simple request itself, right? And we saw that in Peru, we saw that in France as well, using BPI France, setting up a platform for small and medium enterprises to apply for financial assistance. In the case of Peru, we had 3 million people request emergency bonds during the lockdown. So that was the first way the technology has helped, but they also have helped with the continuation of government, right? So how do you do justice during a pandemic when you can't go to the courts? Technology has helped with that by creating virtual courts that we never thought could exist, and now can solve a lot of the backlog we've seen in emerging economies. The same happens for unemployment services, right? In Germany, there were platforms to request unemployment services or unemployment funds, really. Obviously, as well, technology was used to allow schools to stay open, even if virtually. We have a case of, for example, Egypt, that 25 million K through 12 students continued their education during the lockdown because they had access to remote learning platforms that were created specifically for these Egyptian students. And these things were done almost overnight, really. It took weeks to get them set up and resolved, and all because of the scalability of technology nowadays. The same thing happened in your state, Eduardo, in the state of São Paulo. 3.5 million students in the São Paulo State High School were able to continue studying because of online remote learning platforms. And then the fourth reason technology has helped during the pandemic is when everybody was home and nobody could go to the hospital unless you had COVID. Chronic disease patients, folks with diabetes, folks with arthritis, folks with disease that needs treatment over time, they could still get treatment because they did telemedicine. So digital health was also one of the important, I would say, pillars of technology in this pandemic in particular.
Okay, thank you, Julian. And I must add, we are here because of technology, right?
That is true.
Solution we found in this troubled times. But let me continue with the COVID crisis. And I believe people are very uncertain about many things. But one thing that will affect everybody's life is vaccination, potentially bringing back more stability to the world. And we are lucky to have here an expert on supply chain with experience in pharmaceutical value chains across several markets. So, Mr. Prince Boadu, please share with us your expertise and tell us, would technological developments be able to bring stability in a world that's becoming increasingly uncertain, even more with the current pandemic crisis?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I'm really excited for this session. And what I need to let's say make clear is that I think that in terms of vaccination, we need to let's say dial back a bit to understand certain contexts. So the first context I would like to bring up is that first of all, the deployment of technology, like recent nascent technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning and so forth, have been deployed in coming up with these vaccines. The issue here that I see is that most of the data being used to train these computers usually do not have all the contexts that are relevant for all markets, for all people. I mean, we have, for example, over 2 billion people who don't have access to healthcare, and we are looking at about 80% of the world population living in low to middle income economies. And so I asked myself as a supply chain professional that, okay, so what is the data being used, for example, to come up with some of these solutions that we see in healthcare? I mean, additionally, from 3 key points that I need to also touch on is that within the pharmaceutical industry, AI has been used by scientists, for example, to comb through copious amounts of research data or research papers to do very complex analysis, also to look at, let's say, active ingredients combinations that are relevant to solve various kinds of diseases and so forth. Here, my message here is that the pharmaceutical industry should think about what they are selling. They are not selling drugs or vaccines; they are selling trust. So, as I was saying earlier, it's very important that we make the process of these vaccine development very transparent as much as possible, such that when these vaccines are ready for deployment, people, the ordinary citizen or the ordinary person, understands at least to some extent what has gone into the development. I talked to medical doctors even last week, and I know some medical doctors who are not prepared to take the vaccine because they are not really sure what has gone into it, right? So yes, it is true that using technology, ICTs and all that has expedited the process of getting the vaccine to where it is today, but we need to communicate the trust aspect and be more transparent to ensure that when the vaccine as it is now ready, people will be willing to take it. The other aspect is that, okay, the vaccine is ready. How do we get it to market? How do we get it to the ordinary person? And this comes back to my first point, context. So these vaccines must be stored in specific temperatures, right? I ask myself, how does my town in Kumasi in Ghana, right, for example, even get access to this? We don't have cold chains. So from a supply chain point of view, I'm not just looking at the product, but I'm looking at the delivery of the product from the point of production to the point of consumption. Now, within this horizon, it is important, for example, to have reefer containers that have specific temperatures. It's important to have the right logistics and handling of these vaccines. My question, as I ask myself as an African in Europe, is at what point would the market woman in Africa get access to this vaccine? And I think this is still an open question that I still have.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I understand, and talking about the specific technology, I understand you have a large experience with GIS. How do you think we can use geographical information to make the vaccines arrive in the proper way? I know there is a whole logistic issue, but how can we use spatial information to minimize this problem?
Yes, and I thanks for that. I think one of what we do at MapTech is really to leverage GIS solutions, like you said. One of the key things I see is location intelligence, right? So, for example, in responding to disasters or responding to crises, it is important to direct limited resources to the areas that are most affected and mostly are in need of the solution, right? So I've had some, let's say, interactions with, especially in Ghana, some government agencies where we can use specific location data. So, for example, recently Ghana did this mapping of citizens where people had digital addresses. What my company is doing currently is to collate these digital addresses and kind of tag them with specific location data, GPS locations, to be able to, first of all, understand population distribution, income distribution, for example, which are the citizens or people who can afford whatever solution that the government has, what are the specific infrastructure that are currently in place, and what are the infrastructure gaps that are needed to ensure that we can move or transport whatever vaccine or whatever solutions we have to these areas. There's one other aspect of GIS that is kind of intertwined also with artificial intelligence to ensure that we can have some form of heat maps that can be generated for areas that have high cases. For example, in this case of COVID-19, we can have that and do predictive analysis. And here this is crucial because we can easily see patterns and trends using GIS. We can therefore say, okay, look, from the pattern we are seeing in this specific location, we need to deploy X, Y, Z, right? We need to deploy more healthcare workers, or we need to move certain resources from location A to location B to address those solutions. So obviously, I see GIS as a very integral part in the analysis and the predictive analysis, as well as the recovery stage of this whole pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Jessica, let me take from Prince's point on the context. You have experience in policy development, entrepreneurship, and tech innovation, not only in Africa, but also in Asia, and Europe, MENA, and the US, in different parts of the world. So when you look at the measures taken today by southern countries, do you think they will be sufficient to prevent the direct effects of crisis, or will this further reinforce their dependence on the northern countries? How do you see this North-South divide in terms of ICT access?
Yes, thanks, Eduardo. That's a really interesting question. And I would almost turn it around, actually, and point out that it's not just a question of whether the measures taken by southern countries would be sufficient, because if the last 9-10 months have shown anything, the measures taken by any country, no measures have been sufficient, whether in the richest country in the world, like the US, or in some of the poorest. So, one of the things that COVID crisis has made really clear is that this dynamic of North and South, the West and the rest, in terms of crisis response and wealth gap, is crumbling. We have countries like Rwanda, Ghana, Senegal that have done leaps and bounds better than some of the richest countries in the West. So this is truly a different kind of playing field today. So to answer directly to your question, well, no, the measures taken by Southern countries won't be sufficient to prevent all the effects. But also, let's be honest, this is the same application in the North. I'm sitting here in Germany right now, richest country in Europe, and starting tomorrow, we'll be in lockdown for at least a month because our measures have not been effective, have not been enough, even with all of the science and infrastructure and funding available here. So really, from a crisis management and ICT perspective, I see, if anything, even though this is a dark time and we can't exactly call any of this a success story, there has been, if anything, great leadership and innovation shown in Southern countries that the Northern countries, and wealthier industrial countries, can be learning from. To the second part of your question around the reinforcement of dependence on Northern countries, in line with the initial part of my response, if anything, this shows that there can no longer be any presumption of dependence between traditional 20th century donor states and aid recipient countries. The donor states, of course, they're still providing funds that are in the near term and medium term. They are valuable, they're useful, but we have to look beyond that dynamic to who is really capable of solving the problems locally, country by country, whether across Africa or in poorer Asian countries, et cetera, in the developing world. And what we see time and again is that local innovation is going to be more effective than any exported response, exported methodologies from donor agencies, because especially in a global crisis like this, let's be honest, the number one priority of the traditional donor states right now is their home countries and the response there. So, if I am an African government, if I am a Latin American or Middle Eastern or Asian government that has in the past, as to put in the terminology of the formulation of the question, relied on aid, this crisis really makes clear that I must look internally to my resources in country, to the entrepreneurs, the scientists, the healthcare professionals, or also people and companies like Prince, diaspora talent and expertise that can help me use cutting edge technologies to solve my problems, and also to build the regional and South-South collaboration infrastructure to enable the context appropriate solutions to be shared locally. Because just speaking even from the German or EU side, well, we are already up to here in the mess, and our bandwidth to solve the problem elsewhere is not going to be opening up anytime soon.
So what went wrong? Because Jana gave us some very nice examples of ICT-based solutions in different parts of the world. Right? You're basically saying nobody found a good solution for dealing properly with the current crisis. My question for both of you, for both Jessica and Jana, is how do you see that? What went wrong, and what did some countries do that were in the right direction. So let me start with John, and then I move to Jessica.
I think this is just a very different way of doing business. And so focusing on the scale of the problem is, I guess, perhaps the best way, right? It's so challenging in so many different ways, and requires so much creative solutions. As Jessica said, everybody's struggling, everybody's having a hard time. Now, I do think that many governments have done a really good job at trying to maintain a minimum level of service provision of the government, of the workings of governments, right? Even allowing people to work from home in their government capacity. So there's a city in Caligari, there's a city in Italy that was able to allow 99% of their employees to work from home and do the same things that they would normally do in their offices. So there are cases of great examples, and I think those are the ones we should focus on the opportunities, on the things that people have successfully done. The reality is it's a challenge for everybody, as Jessica has pointed out. But if we can be inspired by the things that have gone right, perhaps these can be replicated in countries that are struggling more than others.
Jessica?
Yes, I agree. You know, and to clarify, like, I think the 2 points, so what Jana was saying in her opening remarks and mine, they're not necessarily contradictory. There have been all kinds of innovations that have come out. You know, the taking on of digital conferences and working from home as the new normal. You know, these are things that have been adopted and spread, and that's a good thing. But the point remains, despite all of these innovations that have ameliorated some of the impacts, it is not enough to really prevent the direct effects of the crisis. And also, we're talking about kind of white collar jobs that are done predominantly online from a computer. But the fact that I can work from home or teleconference as a white collar worker means nothing if I'm a blue collar worker and I work in a shop, or I work in a factory. You know, I work in a business that has had to close. So we have to remember that the impacts of this crisis are being felt the most by people who don't have the luxury or the option of working from home.
Okay. So let me ask now Professor Muhammadou Khan. Professor, as scholar with a strong background in different academic roles, I'll take advantage of your expertise and ask you about how you see us 10, 20 years from now. What have we learned so far from the current crisis? What's the future for ICTs in crisis management? Do they seem promising? Would they be able to improve the effectiveness of crisis management? So welcome, Professor, and please. I think you're muted.
Okay, here we go. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. And one of the beauties or dangers of speaking the last is whatever you want to say have been beautifully constructed and conveyed. So I want to associate myself with the comments of my colleagues. So rather than repeating what have been already shared, I want to just quickly go back to the topic at hand, which is global crisis management, before we even talk about ICTs. From my perspective, these crises, global crises, are unpredicted, sometimes uncertain, sometimes undeterministic, and create social changes, which changes the character and characteristics of societies and institutions and interactions among people. And the biggest challenge is how to manage these evolving crises. And my colleagues have shared some thoughts on the most recent pandemic crisis, which is coronavirus. So once we understand that modern crises are very complex and are multidisciplinary in terms of its processes that requires participation of many actors beyond just the emergency services. And what one of my colleagues, the one that recently spoke, I think is Jessica, mentioned that most of the examples that we cite are the elitist aspect of managing the crisis, which is what she mentioned, the people that have the opportunity to have access to devices, to technology. So when we look at ICTs, ICTs around managing crisis, a couple of things. When we look at the education sector, for example, because certainly the pandemic crisis have generated crisis in education from K through 12 to university. But what we have learned that ICTs or digital technologies allow us to deconstruct learning as well as reconstruct education. We also have learned that through these technologies, we can not only disrupt education in itself, but we can change the way we learn. The learning engagements have been shifted and have been demonstrated by the increase of learning technologies and digital technologies, and students can participate and learn from everywhere. We also learned that ICT or these digital technologies is not a panacea in itself, that as much as it brings convenience and opportunities and ease of access to learning and continuity of learning, it also poses a lot of questions and challenges, because the learners as well as those that impart learning have a lot of learning to do. We have learned that through this global crisis that is not just as simple as replacing the classroom with a screen and Zoom or any other technologies. We also have learned that ICTs are enablers. They're not a replacement of learning or effectiveness or quality of learning around global crisis. So that's quite very important, that it is an enabler but not a replacer, but it allows us to augment and deconstruct learning as well as reconstruct education. But it's not a replacement of the human being standing in front of students and engaging them in acquisition of knowledge. So that is critical. The end of the campus, we have also learned that ICTs have provoked educators and policymakers around the globe to begin to question the validity of the traditional brick and mortar of universities and learning institutions. And it has generated rethinking of the education ecosystem and value chain. What we have also learned based on the data that we have gleaned, that it does not necessarily mean that students will learn more effectively or quality of learning and performance will enhance if you take away the campus, you take away professors and replace them to learn electronically. We have discovered that students that have been performing well, at least in the high school data, that have been performing well before the crisis and the ICT intervention tend to perform around the same way they were performing. Not marginal. We've also learned that those that were not performing very well, those that were falling off, by replacing learning through virtual means, it did not help them as much as we thought and expected. Some of them actually end up their performance in terms of quality weakens. So we've learned that ICT enables, it facilitates, it deconstructs, it reconstructs, but it also takes us back to the fundamental importance of the face-to-face aspect of knowledge acquisition and knowledge engagement. Now, let me move a little bit. The other aspect we've learned on global crisis and managing it, and how ICT have played a significant role, is the agility under pressure. Because the uncertainties around global crisis are undefined, are chaotic sometimes. sometimes unrealistic, sometimes unknown. And when we use ICTs, we also discover, we also learn the things that may be spewed through analytical tools as errors might not actually be errors. They might be new discoveries. For example, COVID, we don't know the whole biology and chemistry of COVID. So you may look at glean on a lot of data using data analytics, big data, AI, my friend mentioned machine learning and sophisticated algorithms, and we begin to see patterns and emerging results and outcomes that do not make sense, right? But it doesn't make sense because maybe these are new discoveries that the human ingenuity would have discovered, but would have taken a longer time. But with the sophistication and advancements of algorithms and technologies, we're able to unravel the mysteries of unknown pandemic crisis or data that we would have known otherwise. And we will be able to move more agile, so agility under pressure. And I think the recent discoveries of the innovative vaccines is a result of these advancement and sophistication of discoveries of algorithms and software and data analytics through bioinformatics, working in a much more collaborative, coordinative way and multidisciplinary continents across research labs to move discovery faster. So agility under pressure is what ITs or ICTs have been able to bring to bear. Somebody also mentioned about supply chains and how the efficiency of supply chains and the rapidity of moving along the supply chains have been facilitated by advancement of digital technologies and analytical tools to be able to distribute faster and map out more efficiently and more precise to populations that are affected with crisis, whether it is in refugee camps or whether it is in rural communities. The ability to glean and see data using GIS and other satellite spatial data enable us to be able to prepare for the worst before crisis strikes, or when crisis strikes, to be able to quickly and rapidly have an inside view of spatial populations that would have been difficult for humanity to move very fast. Also, ICTs allow us, or digital platforms and services allows us to be able to rethink what resilience means in global supply chains. It also helps us to diversify and make supply chain disruptive, wider, to be more precise and to be more effective. Also we begin to rethink how we relate, how we collaborate, how we coordinate, how we harness rare expertise and talents that would have been difficult to share or to mobilize. We're able to share and mobilize talent, intellect, ingenuity in bounds and ways that could be impactful and helpful. I think the challenge is what Jessica mentioned. How can we make sure that ICTs and digital platforms and services and emergence can go where majority of our population is, which is in rural communities? And how can we make innovations in these technologies, as I believe Jana mentioned, which is how can we make innovation more adaptable and more flexible and more frugal? So the future in terms of managing crisis is to be able to make ICTs and these digital technologies more adaptable, more appropriate, more sustainable, and more frugal to be more impactful and to create that resilience that is needed, that management of crisis that is faster and rapid.
Okay, I will go back later on this education issue, which I think it's very important, and it brings about an important discussion on inequality that I'll leave to the end. But there is another point Professor Mohammadou mentioned that I think is crucial, which is related to agility. So I would like to listen from the three of you, Prince, Jessica, and Janet, quick comment on the agile response that you perceived in different parts of the world, that actually, whenever they were based on information, based on the right tools, they were able to help minimizing the aspects of the price. So quick comments from the three of you, and then I'll move back to this very fascinating topic of education that Professor Mohammadou raised.
So agility and speed, I think, if I may start, apologies, but agility and speed, I think, were the most impressive things that technology did during the pandemic, right? So several cities, several governments needed to set up contact centers or call centers. And you can do that nowadays from nowhere, really, set up a call center that's fully technological, and that doesn't really require all that many people on the other side of the phone. And those call centers helped governments attend to people's needs, the citizens' needs. They would call in and they'd say, I need information on this, or I need the emergency bond for that, or whatever need that they had for the government. They could funnel that through these fully technological call centers that some of them were set up over a week or over a weekend. And we have examples in Colombia of remote learning set up over a week. In Egypt as well, it took a couple of weeks to set up all the remote K through 12 learning. So speed and agility, I think, was one of the most impressive things that technology gave to us this year.
Jessica?
Yeah, sure. I'll go ahead just with two examples. One on the micro and one on the macro side. So you had entrepreneurs across the African continent, for example, coming up with hardware and software innovations to help address the crisis. And one very simple, very effective hardware innovation that came out of Ghana was a recycled barrel, like an oil drum, if you will, recycled and turned into a portable and powered by solar energy, so portable and renewable hand washing station, completely automatic and touch-free, that you could then build and set up in any public place for people to wash their hands. And solutions like this, just coming from entrepreneurs rapidly, agilely, and affordably to meet the need at hand. I haven't even seen stations like this in Germany. Everybody's been having to just set up their own hand sanitizers inside shops and such, but there hasn't been this kind of thing in public spaces. Then on the other side of the spectrum, an impressive success out of Germany was the rapidity with which they set up the Corona support funds for small businesses. Also for large businesses, but in particular, it was hugely important for small businesses, for artists, for the self-employed. They set up a fund and the digital infrastructure to apply for the fund online for 3 months worth of funding support to survive through the first lockdown. And the jokes were numerous over here because the German government is, shall we say, known and famous for being very slow and bureaucratic. And who knew we could hustle like this when push came to shove? But that was really, it was quick, it was effective, it did what it needed to do, and millions and millions were dispersed, within even just the first week of that program going online. So it really shows, whether at the citizen entrepreneur level or even at the state level, when people or institutions really grasp the seriousness of the moment, we can move quickly, we can be agile. And hopefully one of the biggest lessons we collectively in the international community will take from this crisis is taking the lessons learned out of those kinds of success stories and building them into the DNA of not just crisis response, but our general management. Because, as we see, to the point that Jana raised and also the professor, around education, around access to ICT. These things were outstanding, but it only works if you have access to internet, right? So we need to also address these inequalities in digital infrastructure, in access to technology and internet, because when we keep people offline, it's not just a question of inequality, it's also a question of public health and safety when we have to respond to crises like these.
And thank you, Jessica, for that example from Ghana. It's really amazing when you look at the response that local entrepreneurs, the kind of solutions that local entrepreneurs, especially from most part of Africa, came up with. It was really outstanding. And one other, example that I would like to mention is with another company from Ghana called Incas Diagnostics. So, this is a very young startup, and immediately in the face of this pandemic, they came up with a very affordable, I think it's less than $1 test kit, locally produced, locally manufactured. And I think the last time I checked, they were just about getting the FDA approval, high quality, and it works, such that the average person in Ghana would be able to get a copy, and we're collaborating with the government to see how they will distribute it. So this really actually kind of reinforces the entrepreneurial drive that is happening already on the continent, where young people see a problem or a crisis, and they immediately profile a solution that can benefit. And the other point which I would like to mention, and I think Jessica, you mentioned regarding the access, right? So I've always maintained that there's no point in a solution that exists that cannot be used by the people who are supposed to be the intended beneficiaries of that solution. And so I've seen some solutions again in Ghana where innovations are coming up with SMS-based solutions. So, for example, there's a company called Pedigree that helps to trace counterfeit medication that is coming into Africa and developing countries just by dialing a short code on any kind of phone. So whether it's a smartphone or it's a feature phone, you can just dial in a short code, and then you can verify right in the pharmacy shop whether the malaria medication you're buying, whether it's authentic or it's not. These are really simple solutions that are happening, for example, in Ghana. And another company called Pharma, which also pivoted during this crisis period, to come up with some local based solutions that can address the issues that people have. And the last point I would like to mention in terms of being agile, I know of another startup that kind of brings together health professionals within specific locations to come together to kind of come up with solutions based on the prevalence of specific diseases or ailments in a particular community, and also what are some of the barriers to access to healthcare and so forth. So I think to some extent, some African countries or most African countries got it right based on some of these non-sophisticated solutions that are usually non-bureaucratic and easy to implement.
Very interesting, Prince. Before we proceed, I'd like to remind our audience that you can write your questions on the YouTube and the Facebook chat windows. We'll have, if time allows, a last round of questions from the audience. Well, my next point is related to the some of the issues related to the education that were raised here. I remember, I think Jana mentioned the educational program that we had here at the state of São Paulo, basically for 5 million students. And we had different educational programs for kids around Brazil. Brazil is a very large country, over 200 million people with very strong regional inequalities, right? And despite the fact that the educational program in the state of São Paulo was very successful because it's the richest state in Brazil, we experienced many failures not because of the ICT solutions were poorly designed, but because students didn't have access to what was needed for a successful program. Some students didn't have access to the device they needed, and more importantly, the connection infrastructure was not properly available, right? So why I'm raising this point? And that's a question that goes to all panelists, because in the description of the session, I have stated that what's true for developed and emerging countries is equally true for poor countries, and especially for Africa. So my question is whether you agree with that statement, and what role will social and regional inequality, and regional, I'm thinking about within country regional disparities, which role they will play in terms of guaranteeing all the benefits of ICTs you mentioned, so that they reached everybody. So Professor Mohammadou mentioned about the elitist aspect. Jessica already mentioned inequality, and Prince put that in a very nice way, mentioning the importance of context. So I'll give you the word. Let's start with Professor Mohammadou, and then we move to Jana, Jessica, and Prince. Please, Professor, how do you agree with that? Is this the same everywhere? I think you're muted.
Can you repeat the question? I lost, there was a blip on what the question is.
It's related to the access to the benefits.
Artificial. The digital divide as it relates to connectivity before is not as exacerbated as a problem today. If the policy goodwill is there from governments and private sector and citizens, these technologies have advanced and have been innovated to adapt on different situations. For example, in the remotest villages in most countries, everybody have a device. And the device is a hub of connectivity by and large. The cost of these things have dropped significantly. Of course, access to them and purchasing power is also very weak as you go to the rural areas. So my point is it will require a courageous and conviction of government and policymakers to ensure that there is spread and universal access when it relates to connectivity, especially broadband connectivity and access to these devices, to ensure that there is equitable use and access to ICTs to rejuvenate education. If you realize what I have said earlier, that these ICTs and these digital platforms and services, they do exist and they have the potential for us to reconstruct and disrupt education. But accessibility of it can only be possible with huge courage and determination of government to ensure that the child in the remotest village have the connectivity. But ICTs is not only about connectivity and devices. You may provide computers to schools, and we have seen several examples in Africa. We provide schools with computers with internet connectivity.
I think we have a connectivity problem.
But they are not utilized. Our grid is solar energy to enable these schools and communities to have hubs where the children can actually go and benefit to have access to. Educating and preparing the teachers, those that impart knowledge, whether it is in the primary, secondary, or university systems, is equally important as providing these devices and this connectivity. But they are possible, and they enable us to be able to manage better the confronted crisis within education. But it's not a replacement as well. The physical presence, I just want to finish this point. The physical school systems and the physical universities will still be relevant, but their use and utilization will be redefined if we bring appropriate technologies for learning for this environment.
I fully agree with you on this, the importance of face-to-face. My own research is, I'm an economist, but I do a lot of research on regional science. It's about the human interaction in space. And there are thousands of evidence that face-to-face contact is key for improvement, for productivity, etc. So Jana, do you have something to, some thoughts on this?
Just briefly, I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Muhammadu. On one hand, the digital divide does exist. On the other, people even in rural areas have access to phones, mobiles, some sort of connectivity, even if it's shared computers. And really, the technology has adapted to different realities. You don't have to have the perfect connection. You don't have to have broadband always to be able to access everything that technology provides. And even in countries like Brazil, technology is used as a platform to store TV programs, for example, right? So if you can't offer remote learning platforms, sometimes everything is done through TV networks. But you need technology for streaming, you need technology for storage, you need technology for a number of different things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with technology. And so yes, the digital divide exists, but there are solutions to different levels of economic development and connectivity levels. And on the other hand, as Professor Muhammadu says, in the case of education in particular, you may have the perfect connectivity situation and the perfect remote learning platforms, but if the teachers are not involved or interested in working on technological, platforms, it's never going to happen. So.
Jessica, you mentioned inequality. So given that, as Jana said, there exists different solutions for different levels of connectivity, do you think that's going to increase inequality as the elites, the more, the richer part of the population will have access to better solutions than the poor ones? How do you see that?
Yeah, I'm afraid that it already has. We've seen this across the board, and I need look no further than even here in Germany. A lot of people outside of the country don't realize how bad the inequality here is particularly in the connectivity space. We are a high-tech country, and yet if you even take the train or drive 45 minutes outside of Berlin, there are villages that don't just have no 3G or 4G, but have no signal at all. You have to imagine, what does it mean for kids in a school where they don't have access to reliable internet at home, but are expected to do their coursework online. A lot has been said already to the digital inequality, so I won't say too much more on that. It's a huge issue. But I would also point out that just the basic reality of poverty, even in a rich country, that these inequalities are also only being exacerbated. Countries with high levels of income inequality are also going to experience higher levels of that scissor split widening in this crisis. Right here also, we've seen children whose families are poorer, where they're forced to stay home and to do their schoolwork at home, while maybe a parent or both parents even have lost their jobs. They don't have enough space at home to be able to work effectively. Maybe they don't have the privacy and the quiet that they need to do their schoolwork, in comparison to children who maybe are in the same class or in the same school, but whose parents can comfortably work from home, who are still having their regular income, and where maybe there is more space in the home for them to be able to have some quiet room for their studies. And so even on these like fundamental levels of how and where people live, and what your parents are doing, and how is their income and their stress levels even, these inequalities are really being felt. And here even we've been seeing, so many reports of how in the worst cases, domestic violence incidents have been increasing. And also, much more in low income areas where frustration and stress are higher, economic security is lower. And so these are things really where in this crisis, beyond access to ICT, there's also just the fundamental issue that the more unequal our societies become, the more vulnerable the poorer people in our societies are.
Okay. Chris, do you think we can be more optimistic looking ahead in terms of, well, we had this problem today, but the way we think technological advancements, the role of government in providing proper infrastructure, training, can we see a reversal in the situation where actually there will be technology is going to help us decrease in inequality in the future?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I think it's already happening, and I'm actually witnessing that. So I'm also co-founder for Kumasi Hive, which is an innovation hub that I started with a few friends, where we kind of grant access to young people who don't have internet access at home. Obviously, they can come to this co-working space, and then they are able to interact and network with other young people to come up with solutions. So, I always try to stay as optimistic as possible, but we need to work. And by we, I mean both the government, the private and the public sector need to come together, right? And to really ensure that we intentionally provide these solutions, especially internet access, which should be a basic amenity or infrastructure that every citizen should have access to. I mean, there is a growing movement of tech hubs in Africa. I mean, in Ghana, for example, we have a lot of them springing up where people just need a space that has internet. So space, internet, and then the ideas keep coming. And we've had very pragmatic solutions and really startups coming from some of these hubs. So we need to really sensitize various governments to ensure that there's this strong partnership between the private sector and the public sector, and the role of the telcos are very integral, because the telecom companies really play a very pivotal role in ensuring that there's high penetration of internet across board.
So thank you. We will have a last round of questions, mainly from the audience. We have received here 3 very interesting questions. So the way I'll proceed, I'll read the 3 questions, and then I will give each one of you 2 minutes for answering one of the questions and giving us your final remarks, so that we'll be right on time. So let me read the 3 questions that arrived. The first one is the following: how will artificial intelligence reshape the future of ICT, and how can it be used as a tool to support the fight against the viral pandemic that has affected the entire world since the beginning of 2020? The second question is, we are starting to talk more than ever about the protection of personal data. It's an important issue. Some statistics say that private companies currently hold more personal data of citizens than governments via connected devices and mobile applications. Can this problem be solved? And then we have the one on artificial intelligence, another one on protection of personal data, and we have a third question. How can developing countries collect reliable data and use them in artificial intelligence solutions, especially for those countries who do not have access to internet and ICTs? So this is basic more of the quality of data that you're going to use. So I'll give each one of you 2 minutes. Please try to answer one of the questions, and I would like to listen also for your final remarks. And so I'll follow my screen. The first one is Jana.
So I'll be brief, but I think I'd like to end in an optimistic note and perhaps take the third question. I think there are different solutions for even countries that don't have very good connectivity. There are devices, I would say, servers that are used when there are natural disasters to set up things quickly. And the reality is to have structured and unstructured data is not that hard. Digitizing documents, for example, if you're a government and you have all this mounds of paper, digitizing documents in a way that's now readable, machine readable, is not that complicated. So you can start, governments can start with their digital transformation, even though they may not have the best systems or the best connectivity. And even in anything you can do to create an ecosystem so that other NGOs or think tanks can use the data that governments are generating and are digitizing will help eventually create a very healthy IT provision or service provision in which NGOs are using the data that governments are creating in perhaps artificial intelligence, but you don't even have to go that far. So I think there's a lot that can be done even in governments and countries that don't have a lot of connectivity. And I'll end on that optimistic note.
Professor Mohammadou, your 2-minute final remarks, please.
How will artificial intelligence reshape the future of ICT? My remarks and thoughts on that is it will increasingly shape and improve ICT utilization. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, data science, big data, smart algorithms, deep learning, this will be shaping ICTs and ICT devices and ICT utilization, without a doubt. The challenge for us is to be able to prepare the young adequately to be able to not be consumers of the reshaped ICTs by AI, but to be at the production level. And this is particularly important for developing countries. How can we prepare our young better to be able to be in the production side of the emerging reshaped of ICTs? The fourth industrial revolution will be increasingly AI-driven and machine learning. This is a fact, is a reality. Furthermore, this is where the future jobs will be. So the huge youth bulge and the huge unemployment that we experience in emerging economies, this is a huge opportunity if these countries are able to equip and prepare their young through revamping and rethinking of curriculum and STEM education. So this is very, very critical. Furthermore, for the reshaping of ICTs for the future, developing countries must also view infrastructure to be beyond building roads. That digital infrastructure is as important, if not more important, than building roads in the physical sense. I'm not suggesting we do away of building roads, but I'm saying that as government rethink infrastructure and invest in infrastructure, they must equally invest deliberately in rebuilding digital infrastructure and digital platforms and services by supporting the youth's like our colleague here, Prince, and what he's trying to do, because these are the actors and agents that can help us reshape the future of ICT. And lastly, on the data privacy and inputting, accessing data, this is possible because the beauty is majority of our youths are more inclined and drawn to these technologies, these ICTs. So with appropriate intervention and organization and mentorship and training of these youths through these incubation hubs, through these tech hubs in rural communities and in urban centers, they can be trained like Andeli is doing in Nigeria and Hive is doing in Ghana, etc., to train these young people and channel them to gather data and bring it back to the hubs to clean the data for quality data so that they can feed into AI and big data for analysis. And on a positive note, with reference to education, the reconstruction of higher education is a reality and is not going to stop. The campus and the schools of yesteryears will be augmented. The way this crisis have exposed is the lack of equity and the lack of readiness and preparedness and investment in the education continuum. So countries in emerging economies must modernize education all the way to the rural areas. So the current wave of disruption and the reconstruction of learning is incredible because it will make available high quality content accessible 24/7 for the reinforcement of learning. So this is very, very crucial. We also have to know that the physical campus or the physical school settings will in the future be dynamic hubs rather than a singular point where learning takes place. They will be sources of support, both technical for the young and for the youth, because the children learn today by interacting, by commingling and learning from each other in ways that we've not seen before. So there is an optimism that ICTs will enable education for the better, but we cannot do away from the realities of the fundamentals of face-to-face interaction to be facilitated and enabled by virtual learning that goes in parallel with traditional ways.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now let's move to Prince. You're next to my Prince first.
Yes. Yeah, and I would like to borrow my final remarks from the Prosperity Paradox book by Fosa Ojomo, where he mentions about efficiency innovations. Within the health sector, I believe strongly that we need to, as a community within the health development of vaccines and within the pharmaceutical industry, we need to focus on efficiency innovations that can actually reduce the cost of vaccines and medicinal solutions to the average person. I mean, it's very important to, for example, I read from an academic paper that 50% of AI professionals are in the tech sector and only 3% are within the health sector. So, I mean, if we are trying to, or we are going to come up with efficiency innovations based on artificial intelligence, then we need, as Prof said, we need to get a lot more people educated and moved into this new nascent technological areas like artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, and so forth. So this for me is crucial, that there's no point in coming up with a solution, either it's a vaccine or whatever it is, and if that solution cannot be accessed by the ordinary person, then there's no point in that solution. So we need to focus on efficiency innovations by adopting, these nations' technologies in artificial intelligence and all that I've mentioned earlier, to make sure that the vaccines and the solutions that we have, especially within the health sector, are reachable and accessible. And finally, we need to look at supply chain. So the supply chain of things is crucial. Also, I'm a bit biased because of my profession as a supply chain person, that nothing can be done without paying attention to procurement. Where do I get my raw materials? And where do I store those materials? Where do I manufacture them at the most reduced cost or most economic cost? And how do I transport them? Logistics and topics like traceability and so forth. And even in some cases, reverse logistics. So we need to look at the supply chain of things, looking at where do we get our materials and where do we send the final products to the end consumers.
Thank you, Prince. Now the screen is yours, Jessica, for your final remarks.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience for these questions. My big caveat with this is I'm a political economist and not an AI specialist and or data protection, but through my work and collaboration with deep tech experts, I know very well that around like us, there are limits to our knowledge in this space. So with that caveat aside, what I'm really keen to see over the next year or two is when we start crunching the data from this crisis and the crisis response all around the world, country by country, at what point in the infection curves were what measures taken and where, and how did that affect the growth or reduction of those curves? When that kind of data is getting crunched through the incredible algorithms and technologies available, this can be informative for governments across the world for years to come in future pandemic response to that first question. And with that, so that's one point. My closing point for the public sector side is that we need to share data. Our governments need to talk to each other in our lessons learned to this kind of crisis response, because these crises truly have no borders. And secondly, in relation to the point some of my colleagues have made around youth and education around ICT, we also need understanding of these technologies to become ingrained in our policymaking circles. You know, we many of our countries, you know, have majority parliaments and governments that are populated by older people who are not as familiar with these technologies, and so we really need the younger and the tech savvy knowledge and networks to become embedded features in our policymaking and emergency response institutions, so that these technologies and infrastructures can be deployed more rapidly. And as a final point on the private sector side to the question around data and data protection, this is huge. If I had an answer for it, then we would be having a whole nother conversation. I don't, and nobody does yet. But it's a huge issue that needs to be watched very closely. We will need to introduce some kind of global standards around data collection and protection. And also, above all, we need to ensure that our machine learning and AI algorithms are being informed by inclusive data sets. So making sure that when we are collecting data and when we are learning and teaching our technologies to solve problems, that those data sets are including the full spectrum of rural to urban, of skin color, of body size, you know, of men and women, all of these factors, because otherwise what we also can see is that we'll be creating technologies that are actually exacerbating an inequality in service delivery. And so these questions, though, you know, many people are aware across both the industry, policymaking, and advocacy side. So I'm cautiously optimistic that as the generations advance, that we are more and more aware of these issues and can embed them into our decision-making and problem-solving infrastructures.
Okay. Oh, unfortunately, we reached the end of our webinar. I would like to thank the audience, and a special thank you for the 4 panelists that made this a very special webinar. So goodbye. Have a nice day, everybody. and I hope to meet you in person in the near future. So, bye, I see you. Thank you again for
Thank you.
this very stimulating.
The coronavirus outbreak is rapidly changing our planning and orientations as the world is trying to cope with COVID-19 and face its consequences and challenges. At the Policy Center for the New South, we gave our annual Atlantic Dialogues flagship conference a one-year rest while embracing the rapid digitalization brought forth by the pandemic to offer a virtual alternative. This year's online AD talks are digitally bringing together the AD community that is at the heart of the conference's success, growth, and sustainability.